Good morning, folks. Thank you for joining us today for this Football Playoffs Information Session 2022. My name is John Skees. I'm the Director of Media for TAPS. I'm joined in the office today by Brian Bunselmeyer, TAPS Executive Director, and Robert Huckabee, TAPS Associate Director and Director of Compliance. Will Dixon from the TAPS office staff is helping us out behind the keyboard. This webinar is recorded. It's going to be available on our YouTube page. That's youtube.com/TAPSBiz, where you can find all of our webinars and information sessions. It will also be available on the TAPS website. Just click on the Resources tab and look for webinars and meetings. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Brian.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today as we get ready to move into Week 11. Week 11 games are this weekend, and the playoffs will be upon us before we know it. We wanted to take a quick minute here to set the stage for the playoffs. We've already begun, Robert, getting questions here and there. We just kind of wanted to redo those questions here for you, kind of as a frequently asked questions webinar maybe. So away we will go. One of the most important things as we go forward is everybody is using that same game ball all year long. Big Game Football Factory, and just make sure you're using the leather footballs from Big Game. Hadn't seemed to be a problem so far with the wet weather now. Make sure that you don't go replace them with something old or something different. Big Game Football Factory, the official sponsor of TAPS. We're going to have game administrators at each of our contests. They need to have a game administrator from both teams, both home and visitor. You need to get together before the contest. On duty means you're there when the fans arrive. You're there during the contest and after the contest. Your biggest concern as a game administrator is what's going on off the field, not what's going on in the middle. So if you're going to position yourself on the field, make sure you have easy access to the stands, the fans, and anything else that may come up as a result of what's going on. So again, game administrators required by both teams, regardless whether it's home, away, or a neutral site. Robert?
Thank you, Brian. We get a lot of questions here this time of year of game details, so let's look at some playoff game details. First off, weather considerations. We had weather issues last weekend. Looks like we might have them again this weekend, so some of you have brushed up on those skills a little bit on discussing that in advance, making sure you have all those details together. Both teams are on the same page. Make sure you get your agreements prior to the game. If the game is interrupted or if the game is canceled entirely, when you're going to replay it, probably that next day. Need to get them done as quick as possible, but have that discussion ahead of time. Once the game begins, the weather issues are in the hands of the officials and obviously whomever the game administrator is for the home site. Make sure you're monitoring that weather, have all those things in play, as we know you do throughout the year. All games must be played to conclusion. Remember that. The exception to that is if you get to halftime and beyond and the team that's behind decides, we're behind, we're willing to concede at this point, that can occur due to weather, but otherwise it needs to be played through to conclusion. Remember, in football, you need 5 full days between your contests. So as you're scheduling that first round game and then looking toward the second round, if you have weather issues, make sure you've taken that into consideration. No practices or contests can be played on Sunday. And while we have warm-up games in some of our other team sports, no warm-up games in football. Football just does not allow itself for that opportunity. Let's talk about game site. This is probably the one we get the most questions on throughout the playoffs. In the area round, that's the first round of our football brackets. The higher seed is home team. There's one exception to that. If neither of the schools in that particular game is a number 3 seed or higher, in other words, if I've got a 4 playing a 5, that would be a neutral site game. Otherwise, the higher seed is home in the first round. If you happen to be equal seeds in that first round, it is a neutral site. And then regional round, semifinal round are neutral sites. And you can mutually agree on a home team if you want to, depending on the location of the two schools, but otherwise it's a neutral site. If you cannot agree on a neutral site, need help with the coin flip, TAPS office is always available. Give us a call. We'll flip that coin for you if you can't agree on that. And then obviously TAPS will host our championships. Playoff game details, the date. That's the date that's published on the TAPS calendar. The two schools could agree to play earlier than that, but not later than that without permission from the TAPS office. Time must be mutually agreed upon. If you can't agree, once again, flip a coin. Location, that's in Section 141. We talked about that earlier. Whether it's a higher seed or a neutral site game. That is detailed specifically in Section 141 if you want to look at that, and then mutual agreement on neutral sites. Admission and gate, do that by mutual agreement. Student price, adult price, TAPS passes must be honored at all those games, so keep that in mind as you work through those details. Playoff game details to keep in mind. Health and safety always at the top of the list with regard to the players, trainers, medical assistants, ambulance, those kind of things you may have in place or may choose to do. Make sure you talk about all those details. Security, and then media access. If the teams are live streaming, remember, both teams own the rights to the game, but work through that depending on where the game is located. If you're at a neutral site, have a host facility. Just make sure you've coordinated that with your host facility. Radio photographers, those kind of things. Make sure both game administrators meet and make sure y'all walk through all of that and know what the expectations are there. Brian?
Robert, a couple things came to my mind while we were sitting here. I think we've confirmed Waco ISD Stadium again for all of our championship contests, so that's a good opportunity to be back in Waco, and thank you to Waco ISD for hosting. The six-man football championship date's on Thursday, so going back to your 5-day rule, Sunday does count as one of those 5 days. What does that mean realistically for when the semifinals need to be played for six-man?
Play that on the Friday before. And then you're good to go. We've been doing this for many years. I think our six-man coaches are used to this routine, and they're familiar with that expectation.
And that 5-day rule is a health and safety rule, so that's one that, upon appeal, the board has stood pretty fast that we're not going to move off of that. The other thing that you mentioned were TAPS passes. So any TAPS pass, the little QR codes will be honored, but also Texas high school coaches, Texas high school athletic directors, Texas girls coaches, the professional organizations. Robert, talk to us a little bit about school passes or district passes, especially if you're hosting a game or as you go to those neutral sites. Some of our districts do have passes, and I know a lot of schools have booster club passes. How does that work once you get to the playoffs?
Once you move into the playoffs, those are not honored. This is a playoff game. We want both the schools to be treated equally. So if you have your booster club passes that you've allowed throughout the year for your parents and your fans, or if your district has had an agreement among your district member schools about passes, a certain number of passes or limit of passes, which is common in some of our districts, those are not honored at the playoff level. Only the TAPS pass and the TAPS approved passes that Brian mentioned would be honored in a playoff situation.
The more they can help get us started, the less angst there is when they get to state, because we know that we will be honoring TAPS passes, but not the other two. Let's move on to officials there, Will. Officials, highly important. They're the third team on the field. Remember, they have to be mutually agreed upon. So even if you have the home game, it's going to be on your home field. Both schools must agree with the officials. I think a lot of times there's an easier opportunity if you're in Houston or Fort Worth to get Houston or Fort Worth officials. But remember, both schools must agree. And as always, even if you're using your local chapter, request someone that hadn't seen you that year. Request the crew that you need. Tell them what kind of game they're looking for. Let them try to help you as best they can. If you come upon a point that you cannot agree, then each school would take a chapter, flip a coin. Winner chooses that chapter. Both schools agree to pay. Playoff requirements in six-man. Robert, we're looking for at least a four-man crew. They can use a five-man crew if they desire, as, again, mutually agreed upon. And mutually agreed or coin toss, we say 5 or 7 men. We allow for both, but we need to make that. Don't make it a bone of contention. Some places, by the way, can't get a 7-man crew on a Friday night when everything else is nailed down. So make sure that you're working together. It is a contest that's going to take a lot of cooperation. Big word, but it means a lot in the playoffs. Payment, make sure one team, usually the home team, is responsible for making sure the officials are paid. The pay scale is out there on the TAPS website. It's a little bit more this year than it was last year, so make sure you look at that and pay your officials appropriately. Site-based officials are always important. They're an integral part of the game. So at some schools, the scoreboard operator, the down clock operator, and the line to game crew are all local people. That's true as long as both agree. If you're going to get officials from TASO or another officials chapter for the scoreboard, the clock, and line to game crew, make sure you're in agreement. Tell them what's going on and make sure they're well trained, especially on what's going on as we get a little bit closer. I think the deeper you go in the playoffs, the more you want to see a hired crew crew, but sometimes you can't get those folks. The line to gain crew has been a point of contention this year at several contests, so if you are using the local school's line to gain crew, please make sure you have that conversation with them that they are standing on the visitor sideline. They are there to do a job. It's hard to be the spectator and the dad sometimes and be down there on that line to gain crew, but it is a professional responsibility. Robert, let's talk about, as we go through the officials, I think it brings us to that tough little discussion of removal from a contest.
Yeah, it is a tough one, but it does occur. So just as a reminder, as you move into this last week of football before the playoffs start, if you have a player or a coach ejected in that game, they will serve that suspension, pay that fine in that first playoff game. And then once we move into the playoffs, same is true. If we have an ejection of a player, they'll sit. First half of the next game, the fine does go up in the playoffs, and then for coaches, that suspension goes up. So coaches, be careful. It's a 2-game suspension if you are a coach and you are ejected in a playoff game. So keep that in mind. We certainly don't want that to happen. We hate to deal with those issues, but it does happen. We get those calls. So make sure you address that with your players and coaches going in. Let's make sure that our play on the field is reflective of what you stand for at your school and what TAP stands for as well.
I think the hardest part here, Robert, on removal from contests is our coaches. Remember, it's competition with honor. You are the focal point. The fans behind you, they funnel down to the team funnels down to the assistant coaches to the head coach. So your actions are definitely reflective of your mission and value statements for your school. Make sure they reflect that on the sidelines as well as TAP's competition with honor. I'd love to get through the playoffs with no ejections. That'd be a good goal for us. We know sometimes they do occur, though. And, Robert, what is the only removal from a contest that can be appealed?
The only appeal we have is a targeting call in football. If that occurs, please do not reach out to the chapter that called the game. Reach out to our office immediately. We will assist you in that process. I think I had 3 of them this week. I need the coaches to send me the huddle clip, the clip of the play, to reach out to our office, let us know what happened. We'll get the report from the crew that officiated the game, and then we will run that up to the state TASO office. They have a committee that reviews these. They determine if the targeting call will be upheld or overturned. It's a very good, quick, clean process, so please honor us and that chapter that officiated the game. They're not the ones that review it and make that call. It's done at the state level, and we can assist you through that process as well.
Thank you, Robert. Go ahead and talk to us a little bit about the next word up there on the screen. That's going to be the word protest.
So, to be blunt, there are none. So make sure that when you agree on officials, you've agreed on them, and what happens on the field happens on the field. If there is a critical play, and we know that happens sometimes, there is no protest. We cover that in 2 different sections of the bylaws. Section 27 and then Section 134 on officials. Once the game is done and the officials have declared it final, it is final, and we will move on. Moving on to game finances. This is something both schools need to work out in advance, what facility you're going to use. If it's a home team, make sure the visitors know all the expectations. If it's a neutral site, 2 schools work together. Who's going to work the gate? Who's going to handle all those things? If you're using a neutral site, is your host facility providing all those people? Is it a turnkey type of host site, or are the 2 schools going to have to get together and do that? Security, health, and safety officials, all those things we talked about earlier. Just make sure that from a financial standpoint, both schools know and agree what those expectations are, and make sure all of those people get paid appropriately. If it's a home game, the home team bears all the expenses. Home team retains concession stand earnings, and if there are any funds after all the game expenses, officials, all that has been paid, then the profit is split between the 2 teams. Obviously, the visiting team had travel expenses, so that's why we split those expenses if there are any left over. If it's a neutral site game, one team needs to take the lead and accept the responsibility for all the payments. That's just much cleaner and easier than the 2 teams kind of splitting it up. So one team take responsibility on that. Probably generally it's the home team. Doesn't have to be, but expenses are split evenly between the 2 teams. If the gate and the proceeds do not cover all those costs, and then therefore if there are funds remaining after the expenses, that profit is split between the 2 teams as well. Just make sure y'all communicated that between the two schools, and you have all those details worked out. Brian, anything else on that before you move to auxiliary groups?
I think the biggest thing on the finances is don't leave us hanging. I think that's we'll get an official's call. If your officials, make sure you get them paid up front. We don't need to be hearing December or January, hey, I worked a playoff game and I didn't get paid. Or the same thing from your host facility to neutral site. Please don't leave those out there. Please work together to make those happen. So finances, to us, is pretty clear, cut and dried, but I know when you get into the nitty-gritty, sometimes it's a little different. One thing that is also coming up recently for us is this charge for parking. I know a lot of facilities didn't used to charge for parking, but make sure you agree and both teams understand what's going to go on if you have parking at the facility, especially at a neutral site. So we're going to talk a little bit about auxiliary sites. You've got the teams on the field, the home and the visitor, and you've also got the officials, and then we get the auxiliary groups. You've got the cheerleaders, the dance teams, other student groups under school supervision. You've got the bands and the drum lines. As you go through this, there's a lot of folks going to come to a football game. That's why it's Friday night lights or Saturday afternoon lights. It's a great opportunity to get everybody on campus involved. But one of those things is make sure that you're taking care of them as well. We do a really good job, I think, most schools, of getting the teams oriented, figuring out the locker rooms, figuring out. But at the same time, make sure that you're communicating, especially if you're the home team. Where can the cheerleaders be? Do they have an opportunity to dress somewhere? When are they going to perform? Go test their music out before halftime. All those things are very important. So again, the provisions, where can we be? Where will we sit? Where will they perform? When they can perform, Robert, I believe, is in both section 138, but it's also in the football section. Remember that once the team breaks the huddle, or if no huddle, once they come to the line, the quarterback starts his cadence. At that point, bands have to be quiet at that point. And remember, no artificial sound, so they can't have the boom box on the sideline or something to that effect. So again, one thing as well with auxiliary groups, are you providing a dressing area or not? Are the cheerleaders going to have to come dressed, the band, the dance? Just make sure that everybody has a good understanding. Make it a great time for everybody involved. And one thing that'll make it a great time for TAPS, believe it or not, is this next opportunity, Robert, and that's score reporting.
We need to know who wins the game. I know that sounds obvious, but we're in the middle of volleyball playoffs right now, and every morning we get here and have games the night before, and we're still kind of scrambling around to try to get scores and know who those advancers are to the next round. So it's real easy. Go do those in Rank 1, as always, as we've been doing all year, but we've made it even easier for you than that. If you go to the TAPS website, you click on Athletics. When you get on that Athletics page, you're going to see a big bright yellow box that says playoff game reporting form. If you will click on that form, it will take you to a simple little email me form that comes straight to our office. You can just select their drop downs there. It's real easy. Select the teams and the scores. And then if you already know, if you've made arrangements for that next round game, there's a box there where you can tell us the information on your next round game, when and where you're playing, those kind of details. If you don't know it at that point, that's okay. Go ahead and give us that score as soon as you can. And then you can get us that game info for that next round game. You can send that to our office, always info@taps.biz. But please get those to us as quickly as possible. We know a lot happens when you finish the game, win or lose. There's a lot of things going on. You've got to travel or you've got things to do. Please put somebody in charge of getting that score reported to us as quickly as possible. It takes about 30 seconds, and it does help us tremendously. Helps everybody else who's looking at those brackets and wants to know who advances and who those next opponents are.
Get it reported, get it reported, and get it reported. As you set your game details, please send us an email to info@taps.biz. That'll help us get it on the brackets as well. We update the brackets as quickly as possible. We can only do that with your help. So the website, www.taps.biz. Click on athletics. That'll bring you to the playoff reporting form. Click on football, 6-man or 11-man. That'll bring you to more information as we get closer. Again, championships will be held in Waco at Waco ISD Stadium. We look forward to seeing those who make it that far compete for the championship. info@taps.biz is the email. 254-947-9268. 254-947-9268 is the phone number. Robert, any closing thoughts as we get ready to move through Week 11 and into the football playoffs?
Hey, good luck to everyone throughout the playoffs. Travel safe, and we wish health for everyone as you work your way through the football playoffs. Look forward to seeing all of our teams that qualify for the championship at Waco ISD Stadium.
John, I think that about concludes it here from the TAPS office. Give us a couple of concluding thoughts about the TAPS media opportunities, and we'll have this one wrapped up and sent out to our folks here later today.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Will. And thank you, folks, for watching today. Go ahead and give us a follow at Taps Football on Twitter. That's where you're going to see everything for our state championship, whether it's directions for your fans, whether it's live stream links, all that stuff is there. And please feel free to tag us with your game results or anything that you're posting as you go through the playoffs. We love to retweet and see that stuff from our partners. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our weekly podcast. That's This Week in Taps. If you search for Taps Talk on any podcast app or visit the Taps website, you will see a resources tab for our weekly podcast. And we're trying to report your scores in that too, and that helps when you have that information into us. And with that, folks, please enjoy the rest of your day.